They started out as two-bit punks, street corner hoods from the wrong side of town. They became wise guys, made men, the strutting peacocks of the bootleg years. Courted by the press, celebrated by the movies. Yet behind the glitz there lurked a deeper purpose, to found a business, a criminal enterprise built on rules and rituals, secrecy and fear. The cops seemed helpless. Decades passed before the sleeping giant of federal law enforcement awoke to the threat posed by the mob. Before then, hundreds would die, protecting from the public eye the inner workings of a mob gone underground. It looks like a high-powered boardroom meeting, top executives arguing corporate strategy. But this is a conspiracy of crime. The men at this table are gangsters, and business for them means gambling, prostitution, payoffs, extortion, and sometimes murder. The idea of a secret mob corporation wielding colossal business power sounds like something from a movie, but it really happened.
What they did was they became a government unto themselves. And they really thought they were a government. They were a government in a way that they knew that they could exert, and they still do, political influence. They could bribe law enforcement people, and that they were above the common mass.
How the mob moved from the bar room to the boardroom is the most amazing part of the American gangster story. It changed the way gangsters operate. It changed the way federal law responded to gangster crime. And it was to change the public image of the public enemies forever. As mob bosses grew more isolated, so Hollywood created a new gangster style. Movie gangsters had once been wisecracking underdogs, romantic outsiders taking a shot at the American dream. Now they became loners, haunted by doubt and personal demons. The new style was called film noir.
Nothing to stop me from wiping you all out.
It's got all the sinister characters. It certainly employs the gangster, but it robs him of his vitality. It robs him of being in the spotlight, of rising above the crowd, because there's a kind of general malaise that affects everybody in film noir. They're all haunted. They're all kind of affected by some nagging paranoia.
The classic gangster era would end with murder for some, for others the electric chair, but inevitably with death. The story begins here in New York, 1930. The city was in the grip of economic crisis. Just a few months earlier, the boozy bubble of the Roaring Twenties had burst with a vengeance. Some couldn't believe their eyes. The dreams of a generation lay trampled beneath their feet. Some were angry, some were resigned. But one thing was certain, there was no escaping the consequences of an economy in ruins. Within a year, across America, some 4 million men were out of work. They lived on handouts and welfare. They struggled to make ends meet. No more wages meant no more gambling, no more floozies, and no more liquor. The party spirit of the 1920s gave way to a mood of grim austerity. At street level, the mafia gangs of New York City still held sway. Known as the families, these gangs controlled their home districts and the crime that went on there. But the Wall Street crash put the squeeze on mafia activities, and it triggered a conflict which had been brewing for a decade. The fight was to be brutal and bloody. It was a battle between the old and the new, and it was to shape the whole future of the mob. History calls the conflict the Castellammarese Wars. This is the leading contender in the Castellammarese conflict. Joe the Boss Masseria was a traditionalist. He believed that the families should stick to doing their own thing. An outfit runs on its own, he said, and knocks off anybody in its way. But this man disagreed. Salvatore Charlie Lucky Luciano saw the advantage of gangs working in combination. The mafia should do business outside the family, even with gangsters from other ethnic groups, like the Irish or the Jews. Luciano was not slow to practice what he preached. His lifelong consigliere, or advisor, was a Jewish childhood friend, Mayor Lansky. Even as a boy, Luciano cut a dapper figure in the New York underworld. By age 14, he was already a member of the notorious 5 Point Street Gang and a natty dresser. 10 years later, and Luciano became a wealthy bootlegger. During Prohibition, he corralled entire neighborhoods into illicit booze production. In the tenements, they called the backroom hooch makers alky cookers. As prince of the alky cookers, Luciano was everyone's friend. No mean feat in the bullet-riddled streets of 1920s New York. The Castellamarese Wars began as just another mafia blood feud. And fueling the feud, the mafia code: respect, silence, and vengeance. The heads of rival families were vying for the title Capo di tutti capi, a rank of respect acknowledging the top mobster of the day. But the feud got out of hand. Within a year, over 100 would die. Luciano at first took the side of Joe the Boss Masseria, but the bloodshed convinced him that the mob and the way it worked would have to change.
Charlie Lucky Luciano decided it was time to bring some structure to organized crime, and the idea that bullets were bad for business, and that it attracted attention, and it made for trouble, and it was not worth it, and that they could make more money by getting together and having, in some way, an organization.
Luciano was sickened by the piecemeal killing. He resolved to end it with one last death, that of his one-time ally, Joe the Boss Masseria. Coney Island is a long way from the mean streets of Manhattan. The seaside resort with its fun fairs and roller coasters seemed an unlikely place for a mafia hit. But during the 1930s, on more than one occasion, the boardwalk here was to be stained with gangster blood. It was to a restaurant in Coney Island that Luciano personally lured Joe the Boss Masseria in April 1931. The pretext? To discuss, over lunch and a friendly game of cards, the killing of Masseria's last Castellamarese rival. But as it turned out, Masseria himself was the target. Filmmakers later loved such events for their almost biblical flavor. For here, Luciano played Judas. He was the finger man. Six bullets later, Masseria was dead, and Luciano was chief mafioso in New York. Tucked into Masseria's lifeless and bloody hand, the ace of spades. It was a gruesome joke, typical of the lead trigger man, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The hit guaranteed Siegel a place at the mob's top table and a reputation for a love of violence.
I mean, what do you think of a guy who tells you, you want to kill me? Come on, here. Spins the barrels. Click. Nobody can kill me. I can't even kill myself. Click. Man, this guy was a maniac.
Siegel was another boyhood friend of Luciano. Together with Mayor Lansky, these three men came to dominate gangland during the 1930s. As new boss of America's biggest crime organization, Luciano moved quickly, and what he achieved was nothing short of revolutionary.
he knew there would be disputes. There would be disputes over who controlled certain areas, certain industries, over money. So by having the 5 families establish something called a commission, that's the name they used, like a board of directors. They almost set policy on what would be allowed to be done, what was prohibited, and at the same time, they were there to resolve disputes among the families.
It was incredible. For the first time in one room, listening respectfully to a youthful Luciano, sat the heads of no less than 5 mafia gang families. Later named after their original bosses, Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, Lucchese, Bonanno. All were based in one city, New York, a combination so powerful that the 5 families rapidly became gang lords of the nation.
Of course, the New York families were so important that had influence all over the country. They occasionally allowed some of the other major families outside New York, in Philadelphia, Chicago, Pittsburgh, to sit on these commissions when there were matters of joint interest.
Okay, come on. Let him have his thing. Let him have his thing.
So in that sense, they were able to create this strong structure which in a way protected each other. And no other organized crime group in America ever evolved that way or ever continued for such a length of time.
The average American gangster now belonged to a syndicate, whether he liked it or not. But not everyone was ready to join up. In 1931, there was still one mob boss strong enough to stand out against the syndicate. In Chicago, Al Capone held absolute sway, and Capone wanted to keep it that way. Indeed, the idea of running the mob as a business had originated with him and his mentor, Johnny the Fox Torrio. The point is made in the only Hollywood biopic of Capone. The lead is played by actor Rod Steiger.
Protection from us.
He said, we're going to put down the guns. It's very simple. If they need milk, we got the milk. If they need transportation, we got the transportation. If they need napkins, knives and forks, beef, pork, milk, anything, we got it. They got to come to us.
That's $100 million. Now, when I first came to this town to work for Big Jim and Johnny Torrio, it was gambling and it was dames, all right? Then came Prohibition. That meant the big dough for us. That gave us the working capital. Now we organize. Now we go legit. And we move into every legitimate business there is. You follow me? Now, Lefty, what are you peddling?
You know, beer and the hard stuff.
All right, from now on, only give them beer and the hard stuff. You give them candy, chewing gum, pretzels, anything you can think of. Louis, and the hotels and the restaurants, not only they're going to pay for the linen, but the silverware, sugar balls, anything. And then when the linen gets dirty, they send to our laundry in our trucks, right? That's where it's going to be now, and anything and everything, right down the line. Anybody gives you any trouble, you tell them they should come to Al, right? Comes to Al Capone, right?
Right.
Capone could have played a leading role in the New Look mob. Luciano was ready to cut a deal with the big fellow. But the deal never closed. Capone was facing trial, and his days as Chicago head honcho were numbered. This is where the big shot was destined to end up. The federal penitentiary at Alcatraz. How Capone was brought to trial and convicted caused controversy among lawyers and taught the mob a lesson in public relations it would never forget. He was flamboyant. He was outrageous. The front page was always held for him. He was the most reviled and celebrated gangster of his age, Al Capone. As the New Look mob moved from barroom to boardroom, this man came to symbolize everything the new-style gangsters under Lucky Luciano rejected: prominence in the public eye. By 1931, Capone was already a household name, and through the movies, he rapidly became the icon of the gangster era.
People wanted to go and peek at what everyone was whispering about, and that whisper was about Al Capone. So when these sort of movies started to just explode onto the scene in the early 1930s, they all had a tinge of Capone. They were all colored with that unspoken pointing a finger at, you know who we're talking about.
Capone's fame made him a target. The feds were determined to bring him down. But how they did it still stirs controversy today.
I have no problems with getting rid of bad people. And Capone, as I say, he was a big, brutal, bad man, okay? But you do it within the law. And this is the concern that I have.
Capone was making $25 million a year. He had personally killed at least half a dozen men and ordered the deaths of dozens more. Yet he was tried not as a bootlegger, racketeer, or murderer, but for income tax evasion.
It was a joke at the time. Here you got a man killing, robbing, bribing, doing every filthy crime known to mankind in the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. Now he's being put away for income tax.
The tax rap was a surprise move. Most Americans didn't earn enough to pay income tax, and few took it seriously, least of all gangsters.
The filing of income tax then was not as it is today. Less than 10% of the people in the United States in those years, the 20s, had to pay income tax. So paying income tax wasn't something that we all accepted and knew. And Capone, he was no rocket scientist, obviously, that Capone should know about income tax. I don't know if we can buy into that.
But lawmen had good reason to go for the income tax angle. No one could prove that Capone himself had committed any gangster crimes. Capone's bagmen had paid others to do the dirty work for him. This was criminal conspiracy, but in 1931, such conspiracy was not a felony. For a decade, top gangsters had literally gotten away with murder. This is the man who spearheaded the campaign against Capone, U.S. Attorney George Johnson Sr. The main man on Johnson's investigative team was an agent for the IRS, Frank J. Wilson. Wilson was an unlikely gangbuster. An accountant by training, he was sent by the Treasury to Chicago. It seemed a pointless quest, a painstaking hunt through financial records captured in raids on Capone establishments. Wilson persevered for 3 long years. Most of his colleagues thought it was a complete waste of time.
Pythagoras, where do you want this crap? Oh, that'll be fine.
Wilson's goal was seemingly simple: to prove that Capone earned money from breweries, bars, and nightclubs and had not paid tax on it. But Capone had covered his tracks well.
Capone signed nothing, had no bank accounts, was seen coming and going, and that was about it.
For Capone, paying tax meant declaring illegal income. And that, argued his lawyers, infringed the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. It would mean admitting criminal acts. The judge overruled Capone's lawyers. It was a bad sign for the big shot, the start of a courtroom roller coaster ride that still causes some lawyers concern.
This was not what we would consider to be a model trial in many, many ways.
The feds were out to get Capone, by any means necessary. And that meant using evidence obtained by deception, evidence that fell outside the statute of limitations, even evidence obtained by coercion.
Most people didn't want to testify against Capone. People that knew him, and particularly people who knew him, didn't want to testify against him. So the government had to get them to testify against him.
And the government could be pretty persuasive. This witness was casino cashier Fred Rees. Rees could provide evidence of Capone's income from gambling. He was arrested and held in a very special cell.
And the reason they picked this cell out is that the cell was infested with bugs, particularly cockroaches. It was just infested with these bugs. And they put Rees into that cell. He couldn't eat, he couldn't drink, he couldn't do anything. The poor man was all but paralyzed. And finally, after a couple of days there, Mr. Rees was about prepared to tell them anything they wanted to hear. You're not allowed to do things like that to witnesses.
In spite of such tactics, and in spite of the work of IRS agent Frank Wilson, the prosecution had little hard evidence of Capone's actual earnings. Capone knew this and continued to play the showman. He was relaxed enough to pose for photographs during court recess, even for one picture while the court was actually in session.
Our reporter had a seat, so I got a 35-millimeter camera, and I had it in my hat. I had the camera on open, but I had it covered up so there would be no exposure. My hat was the shutter. And I'm facing Al, and I just went like this and down. Maybe I counted 1, 2, 3 in my own mind.
This is the picture Barati took. The pose was that of a man enjoying a joke. But despite the innocent look, Capone was no choir boy. As the net began to tighten, Capone's goons had tried bribing the jurors. They tried threatening witnesses. They even tried to bomb the homes of the prosecution lawyers.
Al Capone called in 5 hoodlums from New York to kill my father and the federal agents. The Secret Service, fortunately, got wind of this, and Al Capone's cohorts went to Al Capone and said, "Don't do this. You'll bring the world down upon you to kill federal agents." I, as a youngster going to grammar school, had a police escort to school and back again, and my activity was very limited. My friends tell me now that their mothers didn't want them to play with me, baseball or whatever, football, because of the danger.
But the bullying and intimidation didn't work. For Scarface, time was running out. On October 17th, 1931, after a 10-day hearing, Capone was found guilty. The guilty verdict was followed by the maximum penalty.
And if he behaves himself while he's the guest of Uncle Sam in Atlanta, he'll be out again in only 7.5 years. And so, up until 1940, Mr. Capone will be Mr. 40,886. Now for a change, they're taking him for a ride. Let that be a good lesson to you. Always be sure and pay your income tax.
The heavy sentence sent a ripple of apprehension through gangland. After 2 years in jail, Capone was transferred here to Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. This one-time military base was converted into a federal penitentiary to house the top public enemies. Capone was among the first intake. Life in Alcatraz was different from other prisons. No hard labor, plenty to eat. But this was a ploy. Overfed and unfit, the men could hardly swim the mile across the bay to freedom. And psychologically, the inmates had it tough. A strict daily routine was conducted in enforced silence. Capone was not to be released until 1940. By then, his mind was ravaged by long-term syphilis, and he was to die at the early age of 48. As Capone padded quietly along these cell block corridors, a shadow of his former self, he little realized that the trial which brought him here had drawn the battle lines for the way in which the law would deal with organized crime for the next 40 years. The same problems of proving criminal conspiracy, the same temptations to bend the rules to go after known mobsters would dog investigators into the 1970s. Capone had been the greatest American gangster of his day. To an admiring public, he had been a lovable rogue, the self-made Mr. Big Shot who took on the world and nearly won. After Capone, gangsters were no longer glamorous. They were simply mean. Capone's exit from the scene gave New York crime boss Lucky Luciano a free hand at imposing a new look on the mob. The mob was to become a thing of shadows. But all across America, times were changing fast, and events were nearly to overtake even the coldly calculating Luciano. 1933, Prohibition was still in force. The manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol was still a federal offense. Americans had put up with it for 13 long years, but now they cried enough. And the kind of people who had once been the backbone of the temperance movement now spoke in favor of repeal of the 18th Amendment. The reason? They were scared of organized crime.
It's no longer a question of liquor or no liquor. It's a question of racketeers or no racketeers. The 18th Amendment has delivered this nation bound hand and foot to organized crime.
In April 1933, a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, led a new government into repeal. It was the first ray of sunshine to warm an America chilled by economic depression. Overnight, drinkers came out of the closet, and they partied till dawn. Gangsters didn't join the celebrations. Prohibition had given them their greatest source of income, bootlegging. After the squeeze put on their activities by the Depression, many gangsters saw repeal as the last straw. Some gave up the rackets and drifted into the gutter. But the smart ones began to think of other ways to make a dirty dollar. They turned to an old favorite, gambling.
We're a sports-loving people.
Gambling had long held appeal for the mob. It was a victimless crime. It involved collusion and corruption, and gangsters could pose as Robin Hoods, providing the public with a service they wanted.
Illegal gambling, at least in America, is not looked upon as a crime where there are victims. And organized crime, the mafia, has perfected gambling to such a degree that it's what always has been and will continue to be one of their most lucrative occupations.
During the 1930s, mob gambling interests really took off. The mobsters' board of directors, the self-styled National Crime Commission, soon had tentacles stretching from coast to coast. The main enforcer of mob gambling interests was syndicate boss Lucky Luciano's trusted lieutenant, Ben Bugsy Siegel. He went where the gamblers had money, and that meant spending more and more time in LA and in Hollywood. Siegel's job? To tie the mob into existing gambling setups. With every bet, gangsters got a percentage. It's a system that still exists today. The mob also began offering legitimate bookies the chance of laying off bets. If bookies found themselves with too much money wagered on a game, or fight, or race, the mob would take the bet over. For this service, mobsters charged a hefty fee.
So they win every way. They win through their own bookmaking parlors, and they win through other people who are paying them fees for providing information about layoffs and also about what the odds are.
But in 1935, on the streets of New York, a turf war broke out that overshadowed Siegel's West Coast gambling success. The new-style, low-profile mob was drawn into a battle for control of a street lottery called the Numbers Racket. The staging area was Harlem. And the main combatant was one of the oddest characters in gangland, Arthur Flegenheimer, a.k.a. Dutch Schultz. In the groomed and stylish world of the Public Enemies, Schultz cut a strange figure.
The man was a multi-millionaire, but he was a cheapskate. He really was very tight. You know, he never wore anything, any kind of suit that cost over $28 or $30.
Schultz had made a fortune out of bootlegging in the Bronx, but he was a loner, a maverick, a loose cannon. He kept his dealings with Luciano and the syndicate to a minimum. Now he wanted the numbers in Harlem. The Harlem Numbers Racket was controlled by this woman, Stephanie St. Clair. She offered long odds on the last 3 digits of the stock market index, published daily in the newspapers. People would bet a nickel on getting the numbers right. Winning meant a big payoff. Schultz didn't just want a cut of the action. He wanted all of the action.
To most gangsters, it was a penny ante thing. But not when you add up all those nickels and dimes and quarters. Turn into the millions. So he decided to, the same way he took over the beer rack, strong arm. Okay? with his 45 on it. He would negotiate, shall we say, with that big 45.
But negotiations in Harlem proved bloody and costly. Schultz was in breach of the new-style mobster's code. He was drawing too much attention to himself. And sure enough, he became a target of the law. The feds hit Schultz with an income tax rap, which generated national coverage. Schultz beat the rap, but grew obsessed with taking revenge on the man behind the prosecution, New York DA Thomas Dewey. Dewey had political ambitions. He wanted to be state governor of New York. He decided to enhance his reputation by going after the mob. The Dutchman's hatred of Dewey led to a stormy meeting of the mob's board of directors. The always fragile relationship between the syndicate and Schultz finally broke down.
It got to a point where he came out at a syndicate sit-down that he wanted to kill Tom Dewey.
Okay.
But Luciano and the other bosses didn't want to hit a man as prominent as Thomas Dewey.
They discussed it. Schultz went into a rage. What do you call is this? You know, look, you don't want to do it with me? Fine, I'll do it on my own.
One of these.
So when he stormed out of the room, we got to take steps to protect Tom Dewey. Because this loose cannon, this maniac, is going to ruin it for everybody. He's got to be hit. No question about it, he has to be hit.
This was the man chosen for the job, Charlie Workman, known to associates as the Bug.
The guy was a psychopathic killer, stone cold. And he'd kill anybody, believe me.
The venue for the hit was once again to be that favorite spot for mob murder, a restaurant. Charlie the Bug had chosen well. It was almost too easy.
He wiped out the Dutch Schultz mob, just walked, barged right in, went in the back and started blazing away.
When police arrived on the scene, this is how they found Schultz, barely alive. He hung on for 3 days before death claimed him. The incorrigible Dutchman was no more. The Schultz hit marked a new phase in gangster history. Charlie the Bug and his cronies were different from the usual trigger men used in gangland executions. They were part of the most feared and hated group ever to emerge from the back alleys of organized crime. They came to be known as Murder Incorporated. During the 1930s, a scene like this would have struck fear deep into the heart of the new national syndicate of crime. It was reminiscent of a dozen gangster movies. The cops have lifted a hood. They're giving him a grilling, the third degree. The question is, would the hood talk? Squealers, stool pigeons, canaries. Gangsters gave them many names, and there was only one sure way to be free from the fear of betrayal. Such was the law of gangland. And national mob boss Lucky Luciano ruthlessly enforced it. For Luciano, omerta, the code of silence, was everything.
He'll warn you once. You don't heed the warning, you're dead. That's it.
Wrong. He's got fit.
Luciano knew he would need a way of controlling the mopes, bagmen, and soldiers that peopled his empire. His friend and confidant, Mayor Lansky, had the perfect solution, a group of contract killers comprising hitmen from both Jewish and Italian backgrounds. Between them, these hitmen would cover the ethnic spectrum of the mob. They became a kind of syndicate secret police, and those who defied the rulings of the mobsters' board of directors soon understood that by so doing, they courted death. The killer's overall boss was New York gangster Louis Lepke Buchalter. Lepke set about his new job with cheerful zeal.
So anybody overstepping their territory would be eliminated. Witnesses would be eliminated. Even people that were fooling around with some guy's wife or whatever, they were eliminated, okay?
As bodies began turning up, the press got interested. Here was something new, and even for gangland, something particularly vicious: killers for hire. They became the most feared and hated group of gangsters ever to emerge from the back alleys of urban crime, and the press soon gave them a name: Murder Incorporated.
Coast to coast, I think this organization killed in the vicinity of, or close to it, 500 murders they committed. It lasted, just about a decade.
In 1920, Prohibition arrived.
At first, Hollywood failed to pick up on Murder, Inc.'s decade of death. The 1930s remained a time of romantic gangster pictures. Only in the late 40s did movies begin featuring killers so ruthless they were little short of insane.
I'm going to split 50-50 with a cop.
This one was written with a machine gun.
The crazed hitman was perhaps best portrayed by actor Richard Widmark, who starred with Victor Mature in the 1949 movie Kiss of Death.
Kids like to have fun.
Widmark is a contract killer on the trail of a squealer. The staring eyes, the black shirt and white tie. Widmark defined movie gangsters for a decade.
Touch my family and you'll hear singing like you never heard before.
Gangsters might have been going crazy in the movies, but the thinking behind Murder, Inc. made perfect sense. To underworld minds, it was a beautiful creation.
The beauty part of this was that the killer had no connection with the victim at all. He didn't even know the guy. He just knew he had to kill him.
Murder, Inc. would kill anyone, without question, so long as the price was right. Men like Happy Maione and Frank Abondando were no mere gangsters. They had no interest in rackets, gambling, or bootlegging. They did one thing and one thing only: they murdered. And for that, they charged top dollar. Despite their ruthlessness, Murder, Inc. failed to bring order to gangland. What's more, the forces of law were breathing hard down their necks. By the late 1930s, many mobsters were in custody, including the boss of bosses himself, Lucky Luciano. In 1936, Luciano was found guilty of running prostitutes. He claimed it was a frame-up, and it was. Police had planted evidence. Yet Luciano was given the astonishing sentence of 30 years.
At Sing Sing, the droopy-eyed gang leader gets his last glimpse of the outside world for many years. When he comes out, he'll be an old man. New York's big shot is now just prisoner number 92168.
The man behind the case? New York DA Thomas Dewey. The same Tom Dewey whose life Luciano had saved just a year previously by having Dutch Schultz killed. The Luciano bust was a major triumph for the ambitious young prosecutor. It made him a national figure.
For 20 years, the underworld has preyed on our people and robbed them, and then frightened them into silence. But now, the day of fear of the gangster is coming to an end.
Dewey now had the confidence to pursue other mobsters. He set his sights on the dozens of paid killers who belonged to Murder Incorporated.
We don't need to have you in here for nothing.
Dewey's strategy was simple: haul into custody small-time members of the New York crime families, offer them immunity and protection in return for testimony. If they refused to talk, Dewey's men threatened to make the small-time hoodlums' arrest known to Murder Incorporated. That alone was enough to guarantee death. At first, the lowlife stayed true to the gangsters' code of silence, but Dewey's ploy began sowing seeds of fear and doubt among higher echelons. Murder, Inc. boss Lepke Buchhalter grew terrified of indictment. He imposed a reign of terror on gangland.
The bombshell
As this
that
later movie
exploded
from
it all.
1960 showed, Lepke's death squads embarked on a killing spree which all but destroyed the mob.
Accounted for the incredible total of approximately 1,000 killings executed by Murder Incorporated.
Finally, one man dared to break the silence. Abe "Kid Twist" Reles had coordinated dozens of Murder, Inc. hits. In 1939, this canary began to sing.
He knew the minute details of at least 85 murders. On a Good Friday, when he started singing, he sang a grand opera.
The heat was on, and Murder, Inc. boss Lepke Buchhalter was the prize. He suddenly found himself a national fugitive. He was branded public enemy #1. Tom Dewey pursued him relentlessly.
This fugitive must be found dead or alive. The New York police and federal agents are working together in a nationwide search.
Lepke eventually surrendered at a fun fair on Coney Island, not far from where Lucky Luciano had fingered Joe the Boss Masseria just 8 murder-filled years previously. Lepke was tricked into giving up without a fight. In 1941, Lepke was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to die in the electric chair. Eventually, 4 other Murder, Inc. stalwarts were to follow him into the death chamber.
Happy Mayoni, whose favorite weapon was a meat cleaver. Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, probably the most bloodlusting killer out of all Murder Incorporated. Bugsy Goldstein, Frank the Dasher Abandando. Those 4 got the chair.
To this day, Lepke and his Murder, Inc. confederates remain the only top gangsters to be executed for murder. Dewey got his men and his reward. In 1943, he became governor of New York. But not everyone enjoyed the fruits of the Murder, Inc. bust. In a small hotel here in Coney Island, the man who had played such a vital part in breaking the chain of silence and murder was to pay a heavy price for his collaboration with the DA. And the classic gangster era was about to enter its final phase. If lawmen felt they'd won a major battle in the war against gangsters, they were in for a shock. Holed up in a Coney Island hotel, awaiting a courtroom appearance, was Murder Incorporated turncoat Abe "Kid Twist" Reles. His testimony had already led to indictments of 5 top Murder, Inc. hitmen. Indictments that would send the killers to the electric chair. And Reles had more to say. He knew a lot of things about a lot of powerful people.
He was mentioning politicians, police brass, top police brass, politicians, as well as gangsters. This guy has to go.
Reles was found in the hotel parking lot. The coroner said he fell while climbing from the 6th floor window of his room. But not everyone believes his death was accidental.
He fell my eye. He fell. He didn't fall. Somebody threw him out that window.
Reles' death showed that Murder Incorporated could still hit anyone, even those under police protection. Panic now gripped gangland. Hoodlums feared retribution for the slightest indiscretion. They imagined killers on every sidewalk. No wonder that some mobsters decided to quit town. Among them was the mob's gambling chief, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. To get away from the mounting hysteria in New York, Siegel headed west to his favorite stomping ground, Hollywood. Siegel had spent a lot of time in Los Angeles looking after the mob's West Coast gambling operation. He was increasingly out of step with the way the mob was going. Not for him the back alleys of Murder Incorporated or the dull boardroom sessions of the National Syndicate. Instead, Siegel played the role of the classic gangster, spending money, hogging the limelight, living the high life. And Tinseltown took him to its heart.
You're cute.
Hollywood had spent the 1930s obsessed with the romantic image of the lovable gangster. And Siegel seemed to fit that role. Siegel looked like a movie star. He lived like a movie star. It was rumored he wanted to be a movie star. He was the last of the maverick gangsters. His life and death would come to symbolize the end of the classic gangster era. At first, Siegel lived here in the luxury of the Argyle Hotel, North Hollywood. Among such high-class surroundings, he began hobnobbing with movie people, including an old friend, actor George Raft.
Bugsy Siegel came to Hollywood, and he was seen around actors and film producers in a nightclub. Became very friendly with them and also met George Raft.
Raft was well known for his connections with the New York mob. He and Siegel had been friends since the 1920s. Together, they hatched a daring business plan.
They decided to go to Las Vegas, which was actually nothing but desert land, and they decided to build a casino for gambling purposes. And the name of the casino was called the Flamingo.
The Flamingo was ambitious, even for Siegel. It was so called after the nickname for Siegel's red-headed girlfriend, a singer named Virginia Hill. Siegel's dream was to build a gambling paradise within driving distance of LA, but free of California's strict gambling laws. He had sold the idea to the National Syndicate, and the mob had bankrolled the project heavily. Siegel entertained lavishly to attract prospective patrons and secure favorable publicity. He became the darling of the Beverly Hills party circuit. Siegel's partner, actor George Raft, also did his bit to drum up support for the new club. But then things began to go wrong.
George Raft was to bring in people from Hollywood to keep the business going. And as we know today, Bugsy Siegel had borrowed some money from the underground world, and Bugsy Siegel's girlfriend somehow was able to manage to get her hands on $2.5 million and disappeared, went to Switzerland.
Virginia Hill had taken the mob's money on the lam. It was to be her boyfriend's downfall. In June 1947, the National Syndicate voted on the fate of Bugsy Siegel. For years, Siegel had defied their rulings. He had thumbed his nose at their edicts. He had become dangerously visible. Now he had ripped them off. Benny Siegel was the last of his kind. The other greats of the classic gangster era were already either dead, dying, or on ice. Dutch Schultz murdered, Lepke Buchhalter executed, Al Capone desperately ill. In a world where gangsters had become businessmen, Siegel just didn't fit in. He was out of step with the way the mob was heading. He would have to go.
I'm telling you straight. Forget that you ever seen him.
What happened next made a memorable climax to the 1991 Oscar-winning movie Bugsy. Alone at home, the doomed mobster entertains himself by running his own movie screen test. Outside, an assassin lurks.
I was worrying about Henry. I figured I wouldn't marry him because he is a regular guy, and he's been swelled, but now I will marry him. Oh, I'm so sorry. I beg your pardon.
The murder said it all. A gangster obsessed with his own self-image sees his life shatter around him. The fancy decor, the stylish suit, the sexy mall, the movie glamour. All of it smashed by bullets from a paid killer. Siegel was the last of the flamboyant gangsters. At least in real life. Gangsters became corporation men. But in the public's imagination, they still retained that Hollywood style. Their exploits lived on, forever symbolized by some of the biggest stars in motion picture history. As gangsters retreated from the streets into the boardroom, they also retreated into legend.